So, as I was saying, John, we've only had a personal connection for a couple of months. Really, I sort of throw you an early copy of the book, and I had my fingers crossed. I thought, God, what's he going to say? And what did you think of it when I threw you that draft?
Well, it's also good following Carl, because as we know, all quality comes from New Zealand. But ignoring that for a moment, Victoria's not so bad either. And my first reaction is that, wow, we have a million books on how to teach and hardly anything about the concept of learning. And we talk about teachers' professional learning, and we forget what the learning part is. And I was listening to Carl then, that whole notion, like the good news is that kids couldn't care less about how we teach. They care about how they learn. And so it's not surprising that we as educators get a bit concerned about the whole teaching part of it. But a book that is actually focused on how you go about teaching the science of reading. So I want to congratulate you first, Carl, on I know it's your fifth book. I also envy your writing skills. I'm very good at writing academic ease, and that's not what teachers want to read. And so you've got that balance. So that appealed to me as well, that it was very readable. It included a lot of the work about the whole notion of science. And I remember a few years ago here in Victoria, we had a bit of a push from the government about high impact teaching strategies. They also released another document at the same time about high impact learning strategies, which disappeared. There was no interest. So we're fighting uphill here. And so I'm going to ask you a question, James, which goes to the heart of why I like the book, is that when I ask teachers, many of you here today, what's your model of teaching? You can't shut them up. They can talk for hours about their model of teaching. But then I ask you, what's your model of learning? How do you go about learning? Even as adults in the business, we struggle. So that limited vocabulary we have about learning, the limited vocabulary that students have, and you mentioned, Carl, a lot of kids sit there and they learn very quickly by about age 8 that their job is to look like they're interested and hope they don't get picked on. And I remember my own son, he was 11 when he had the conversation with me, that sort of one of those awkward moments. He was one of those kids, sat there, teachers liked him. We knew he went to school for lunch, sport, and girls. And he said to me, Dad, I haven't a clue what they're doing at school. I'm a fraud. There's a lot of kids like that, too many kids. So, James, how do we get teachers to think about their own learning and how they learn? How do we get them to have a model of learning? How do we get to see and give the students a language of learning? And I know I'm going to ask you to sum up your whole book in a few sentences here, but that's the beauty of what I saw you trying to do.
Look, and I'll try and give you an answer in a few sentences too. I think one of the key things, and I think Elizabeth and Jan and Carl will agree with me, one of the key things to start that conversation is to give teachers permission. We're in such this, it's all about the teacher. It's all about your teaching strategies. You make learning happen. And teachers are under this enormous pressure and this feeling of it's all up to me to make sure students learn. And when I come in and talk to them and say, it's all right, you are a great teacher. The part of the problem that's going on here is not what you're doing, it's what they're doing. And they go, oh. I say, you've got great teaching skills. You know how to teach, you can do this. What we need to do is to teach them how to learn. And that shift to recognize it's not just up to the teacher, it's up to what the students do as well. And I described that in that learning equation, that it's the growth occurs from the skill of the teacher and the skill of the learner. And when teachers get that, they go, oh, all right, I actually sort of knew that, and thanks for saying it. And that gives them permission to start saying, well, all right, let's talk about learning. Now, I think Jan would be the first to tell us, and I hope you don't mind me quoting you, Jan, that the I do, we do, you do model of teaching and learning is limited by the I do part. And that teachers, many of us, aren't very good learners. We have spent a long time in our comfort zones and being given that language, like Carl walking out and saying, oh, no such thing as talent. By the way, of course, there's something called talent. It's just not a magical thing that you're born with. It's something you develop and grow through that process of deliberate practice, etc. So I know what you meant by that. But that idea of helping them understand the learning process, giving them the language, the habits of mind, giving them the language of the zones, changing the meaning of mistakes. Did I say 2 sentences I was going to answer in?
You're writing another book.
Yeah. All that. But I think that's where it starts. It starts with just that recognition of, hey, it's not just you. And I come back to that John Holt quote that really kicked me off, that learning's not the product of teaching. Learning is the product of the activity of learners. And this now is a time with learnership to focus on the activity of learners.
You added your byline to the book, from an act to an art. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, look, when we see something done well, we see it as a thing of beauty. We see it as a thing that we recognise has taken time and effort and resources, and there's a beginner and an expert. And at the moment, most people, when they talk about learning, it's kind of one-dimensional, like we learn. And maybe there's some learning strategies that happen along the way, but people learn. And it's not a case, we don't think of learning as something skillful. So the byline of the book about raising the status of learning from a mere act, something that's done, to an art, something you develop, something you extend and build on, something you learn to do well. And I come back, and I know I shouldn't use this metaphor, because sometimes when I talk about the Torvill and Dean example, there are too many people in my audience that don't know who Torvill and Dean are. But nonetheless, Torvill and Dean, if you don't know, figure skaters at the Olympics, I think about 82 it would have been, but ice skaters, and the way they partner each other. We know what skillful teaching looks like. What I've tried to do in Learnership is talk about what skillful learning looks like. And that, when done in partnership, is what leads to growth. So the byline about raising the status of learning from an act to an art, I imagine a time when teachers, leaders, principals, walk past a classroom with the knowledge of what skillful learning looks like, and can look in that window and go, what that kid's doing, that's beautiful. That's what I want to see happen.
One more, James. When I look at the research on a really good study recently, where what happens in a classroom when a teacher asks a question, student puts their hand up and they give the wrong answer. 50% of the time, the teacher corrects the student. Up to 50% of the time, the teacher asks another student to correct the student. Less than 3% of the time, that error is seen as an opportunity. It's no surprise that kids think school is about getting it right. And if you don't get it right, you aren't in that business. I also know from the matter studies we've done on classroom observation that teachers talk 89% of the time. They ask 150 to 200 questions a day that require less than 3-word answers. And here's the interesting part, the conspiracy. Kids above average want teachers to talk more about the facts, because that's the game they'll win at. One step further, we know why teachers don't ask students and wallow in the error and do what Carl's daughter was saying, where they get dirty and they go down into the pit, etc., because it dents their self-esteem. So all that put together, it's no surprise that classrooms are reasonably compliant, that classrooms are about getting it right. And I would argue that probably half the kids by age 8 have learned that schooling is not for them, it's to be survived. What chance do we have after reading your book?
Oh, every chance in the world. Now move on to the next question.
And can I just say also, just one last comment there. I also know that Costa's on this. He's been arguing this for probably as long as I've been around, that we've got to bring this whole notion back in to get the students thinking aloud, to hear what they're thinking, to give them the skills of thinking, to know what to do when they don't know what to do. And I think this is, and you've actually summed it up into those nice kind of 5 elements of learnership. And so you asked why I like the book, it's all that.
Thank you. And I think it's worth, just for those of you who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, those 5 elements are there because the challenge is what drives growth. Like we've heard Carl sort of saying, when you just keep doing the same stuff, you don't change. And we want to put that focus on growth and development. There's a whole lot behind that. But if challenge is the pathway, then the habits of mind are the verbs that take you down that path. They're the actions you take. And whether we do them in specific, small strategies like note taking or whatever it might be, they require the disposition to do that. And that's what Art Costa and Bennett Kalick described. The mistakes and the feedback, that's about the information you need to continue down that journey. And the effort part, the time and energy, is about the resources it takes to take that journey. And so if we're talking about building your backstory, I talk a lot about backstories in the book, from being a relatively useless 3-year-old who can't do very much at all, to being someone who's out there being extraordinary in the world, having agency and being the master of their circumstances, then I hope what I've tried to describe is the pathway to the way to journey down that path. So, and it's been a real thrill, John. I'd love to sit down with you and Art and a few other people in this room today and just, open a bottle or 2 of wine and just have a chat, but maybe not today. I think it must be about 10 o'clock for Art by now. So yep. Thank you.
Good night, all.
We would be remiss if we didn't invite Elizabeth onto the stage. So a big round of applause. Thank you, John. I don't know what the issue we had, but I'm glad we had it resolved. Thanks for being here today, and hopefully we can continue this conversation down the track as well.